In 161 AD, a man assumed command of the largest empire the Western world had ever known. He did not want the position. He had been designated heir by the Emperor Hadrian, trained for decades in Stoic philosophy, and privately preferred the life of a scholar. His name was Marcus Aurelius, and on the same day he became emperor, he began writing a private journal, never intended for publication, never addressed to anyone, in which he gave himself daily instructions on how to think. What he wrote has survived nearly 2,000 years, and it reads as if composed for the precise anxieties of the present moment. Those notes are the meditations, and within them are 5 governing principles that Marcus applied, repeatedly and deliberately, to master what he considered the only domain any person truly owns, the mind. These are not aphorisms. They are operational rules, tested in conditions of war, plague, political betrayal, and personal grief. If the Stoics' approach resonates with you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Marcus returned to these 5 principles not because they came naturally to him, he was explicit that they did not, but because he understood that the untrained mind is a source of its own suffering. What Epictetus, his greatest philosophical influence, had said from a position of slavery, Marcus now had to practice from a position of absolute power. The challenge, he discovered, was identical. The first and most foundational rule Marcus Aurelius applied to his own mind concerns not what happens to a person, but how the mind receives what happens. In Meditations 4.3, he wrote plainly, "You have power over your mind, not outside events," and he insisted that realizing this is the source of strength. This is not a motivational claim. It is a precise psychological observation about the structure of experience, because every event arrives first as raw sensation and is only transformed into suffering, resentment, or joy when the mind appends its judgment to the bare fact. The Stoics called this faculty the hegemonikon, the governing principle of the mind, and Marcus believed its disciplined use was the primary task of a rational being. What this reveals is that perception is not passive. It is an activity, and like all activities it can be performed well or poorly, which is why Marcus devoted so many entries in the Meditations to catching himself in the act of adding unnecessary interpretation to neutral events. He described the practice explicitly in Meditations 6.13, noting that when something external causes distress, the pain comes not from the thing itself but from the estimate you place upon it, and that estimate can always be withdrawn. This is not indifference, and it is critical not to mistake it for one, because Marcus was simultaneously capable of deep grief, as his letters to his teacher Fronto confirm. What the discipline of perception produces is not the absence of feeling but the refusal to allow untested judgment to manufacture suffering that the event itself does not contain. But if perception is the first discipline, what governs the actions that follow from it? And here Marcus introduced a distinction that complicates everything most people assume about Stoic practice. Marcus Aurelius inherited from Epictetus, whose discourses and Enchiridion he studied closely, a foundational division that stands at the center of Stoic ethics, the distinction between what is up to us and what is not. Epictetus, writing in the Enchiridion I.1 from the position of a man who had been enslaved, identified this division not as a consolation but as the most precise and demanding insight available to a rational mind, because it requires the practitioner to perform an honest audit of every goal they pursue. Marcus translated this into his second governing rule, which was not merely intellectual but behavioral: act with full effort on what lies within the domain of your will, and release your grip on what lies outside it entirely. What makes this rule harder than it first appears is that most human suffering is generated precisely in the gap between these two categories, in the attempt to control outcomes that were never within reach to begin with, which is why Marcus returned to this distinction dozens of times throughout the Meditations. In Book V.8, he described his own work as a Roman emperor, the campaigns, the decisions, the political pressures, as material to be engaged fully and then surrendered to consequences he could not determine. This was not passivity. It was a deliberate redirection of energy away from anxious grasping toward disciplined execution, because Marcus understood that a mind consumed by the need to control outcomes it cannot control is a mind that has already abandoned the one domain where it has genuine authority. The practical implication is more radical than it sounds. It means that failure, as ordinarily understood, is not the same as a failure of virtue, and that the quality of an action is measured entirely by the intention and effort applied to it, not by what the world returns. And yet this raises a question Marcus confronted with unusual directness in the Meditations: what happens to the will when it must act under conditions of loss, impermanence, and the certainty of death? The third rule Marcus applied to his own mind is the one modern readers find most difficult to inhabit: the daily, deliberate contemplation of death and impermanence. In Meditations 9.3, he observed that Alexander the Great and his mule driver were reduced to the same condition by time, and he returned to this theme with a consistency that is unmistakable across the entire text, not as morbidity but as a precision instrument for cutting through distortion. The Latin phrase memento mori, meaning remember that you will die, was not invented by Marcus, but his treatment of it in the Meditations is among the most philosophically rigorous available, because he extended the practice beyond personal mortality to the impermanence of reputation, achievement, and even the entire Roman civilization he was governing. In Meditations 4.32, he noted that all the men of the age of Vespasian are gone, their marriages, their debates, their ambitions, and that the same erasure awaits every name currently considered important, which means the most urgent questions are not about legacy but about the quality of attention given to the present moment. What this practice produces, when applied consistently, is not despair but a recalibration of value. When mortality is held in view, the trivial loses its capacity to generate anxiety, because petty grievances and status competitions cannot sustain their grip against the one certainty every human being shares without exception. Marcus was not recommending withdrawal from the world. He continued to govern, to fight wars, to raise children, and to mourn their deaths, but he was insisting that the mind which refuses to acknowledge impermanence is a mind that will be endlessly ambushed by it. The practical discipline was not to dwell in grief but to let the awareness of finitude clarify what actually deserves the mind's energy. What Aurelius said next, however, moves beyond acceptance of loss into something philosophically stranger and more demanding: a love of what is, precisely because it is and cannot be otherwise. The fourth rule Marcus Aurelius applied to himself is captured in a concept that Nietzsche would later name Amor Fati, love of fate, though Marcus articulated it 2,000 years earlier with a precision Nietzsche did not always match. In Meditations 7.9, Marcus wrote that we should accept the things to which fate binds us, and love the people with whom fate brings us together, and do so with all our heart. This is not resignation. It is an active affirmation of reality as it is, which requires a deeper discipline than mere acceptance, because acceptance still implies a spectator tolerating what they would prefer to change, whereas Amor Fati demands that the practitioner find in what actually exists the material for a fully engaged life. Marcus applied this to plague, to the deaths of children, to the betrayals of political allies, and to the physical pain that accompanied his final years, and his application of it was never described in the Meditations as effortless, which is precisely what makes it credible rather than merely aspirational. The fifth and final rule is the one that holds all the others together, what Marcus called the return to reason, the practice of noticing when the mind has drifted into passion, fear, or resentment and deliberately returning it to its governing faculty. In Meditations 8.7, he described this return not as a defeat but as a victory. Every time you bring yourself back, he argued, you are doing something that takes more genuine strength than any external conquest. This is the most practically applicable of all 5 rules, because it acknowledges that the discipline of the mind is not achieved once and retained permanently, but must be renewed in each moment of distraction, each surge of anger, each anxious spiral, and that the willingness to begin again, without self-condemnation, is itself the practice. Together, these 5 rules form not a philosophy of withdrawal from the world but a philosophy of maximum engagement with it from a position of internal stability, and that, Marcus insisted across the entirety of the Meditations, is the only foundation from which a rational being can act well. What the Meditations reveal, taken as a whole, is that Marcus Aurelius did not believe mastery of the mind was a natural gift reserved for philosophers. He believed it was a discipline that had to be practiced daily, imperfectly, and without the expectation of permanent results, which is why he wrote the same instructions to himself again and again across 12 books. The 5 rules he applied, the discipline of perception, the dichotomy of action, the contemplation of impermanence, the love of what is, and the continuous return to reason, are not separate techniques but a single integrated practice, each one reinforcing the others in a cumulative structure that prevents the mind from becoming the source of its own suffering. The practical implication for the viewer today is direct. The conditions Marcus faced were different, but the mind he was working with was the same instrument every human being carries. The Stoics wrote for themselves, but what they left behind survived 2,000 years for a reason. Subscribe, and we will keep exploring why.